What the ultimate goal is to improve quality of life until the point where you do succumb. And if you can't exercise, it may be your only recourse. In that light, we do the same as exercise, but what we do is we activate the mitochondria from the outside. Another very important area is diabetes, metabolic dysfunction. It's engulfing the world. Because it activates the mitochondria of muscle very effectively, you get very strong and very robust metabolic changes. We can help them maintain metabolism where their metabolism would normally start to fail, and we have evidence showing that is true. We are now starting to characterize what it is that muscle is producing, and we've actually uncovered some really interesting agents. One agent is known to be anti-aging, and it's turning out to have anti-cancer effects. Now, it's interesting that when fat is activated by the muscle secretome, it then becomes a secretor itself. And it secretes things back that actually reinforce this positive communication. It's called muscle-fat crosstalk. I honestly feel that ultimately this technology will become a lifestyle intervention.
Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Health Geeks podcast. Today I have with me Professor Alfredo from QuantumTX. They are the company that produce the BIXEPS machines, which to a certain extent replicate the effects of exercise. Before we go into the technology as well as the details behind the machine, one quick update. Starting this episode, I'll be sharing with you the latest stuff my team has been up to on our ALLWIN platform. For instance, we've been working to get exclusive deals for you through our partners, including QuantumTX, the feature of today's episode. Other companies like AG1, What If Food, and Recurrent Systems are also on our platform. Feel free to check it out at allwin.co. For now, back to the episode. Hi Prof, firstly, thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
First question to you is, what are the effects and the benefits of using the BIXEPS machine, as well as what's the science behind it?
Okay, so let me start with the benefits. The benefit is really its ease of use. It's a non-invasive treatment, so there's no preparation that the subject has to take part in. You can be a normal person to run the machine, so it doesn't take any expertise to run the device. The treatment itself is only 1 10-minute exposure, once or twice per week. So the convenience is definitely what its benefit is. Now, how it works is that it recruits a common pathway with exercise, but it is not exercise. Exercise is more encompassing. Exercise calls into action brain communication with the muscles. Exercise releases adrenaline, the endorphins, these kind of things. We do not do that. Exercise may make your heart rate increase, will make your blood flow. These are specific for exercise, and exercise is much more broader in scope. But what it has in common is that it utilizes energy. So what I want to say by that is that when you undergo exercise, any kind of exercise, you require energy. And the only way that muscle knows that it's been activated, the muscle doesn't have a mind of its own. The way the muscle knows that it's been activated is by energy production. And energy production is the role of a small part of the muscle, a small subcellular part called the mitochondria. The mitochondria can be envisioned like the furnace of a cell or the muscle. So that's where energy gets burnt. That's where energy gets combusted. It gets utilized for ultimate movement, right? Now, in that light, we do the same as exercise, but what we do is we activate the mitochondria from the outside. So our low energy magnetic fields have always been specifically designed to increase the energy production of mitochondria. In a sense, it's like a catalyst that actually turns up the heat, and then the mitochondria start producing energy. From that point on, muscle doesn't distinguish it from exercise. Muscle sees it as an exercise response. Now, that's the important part. That's where everything comes together. When muscle utilizes energy, that is its signal to kick off a chain of events. Because as we all know, muscle is healthy for the whole body, not just the muscle that's exercised. When you exercise and your muscles are activated, your fat undergoes changes. Your liver undergoes changes. Your bones and your joints undergo changes. But you're not exercising those tissues specifically. It's only muscle that is contracting and using energy. So when muscle gets activated, what it does is activates a certain aspect of its function, which is the secretome response. And what I mean by that is that muscle acts like a gland. When muscle energy metabolism is activated, muscle starts to secrete things into the bloodstream. And these factors, once they're in the bloodstream, travel to all the other tissues of the body where they induce regeneration. They are sort of a rejuvenation elixir that is actually released by muscle. And that's one of muscle's most important metabolic roles. We are mostly muscle. The average person is about 40% muscle, 45%. So because we're mostly muscle, muscle has evolved to do this. Muscle is our adaptive tissue. When you undergo training, when you exercise, the reason the body adapts is because muscle is assuming this role. When you stop exercising, the body regresses, right? So it's always a constant process of adaptation. We're made to adapt to the environment. Now, when an athlete goes and starts to train, all it's doing is actually changing the mechanical environment around it, right? So what I mean by that is that any kind of movement really is exercise in this context. We are always under a 1G force, one gravity force. Most of us take it for granted. Most of us don't really think about the force that's always on us. But if you were to fall down, you would feel that force. So when a weightlifter takes a weight and puts it in his arms, all it's doing is adding to his gravity. And because we adapt, the body interprets that as a change in the gravitational field. And it starts to change itself, adapt itself to meet that new challenge, right? So we are always constantly in a process of adaptation. That's how we work. If we stop adapting and we regress. So we're always trying to optimize ourselves to the environment. Now, in the early days of life, I had to be fast enough to catch that antelope. So I had to be light enough and slight enough to do it. If I was too big, I'm carrying too much weight. So you're always looking for an optimization point by interacting with biophysical forces. Now, that's why muscle evolved to do what it does. It adapts us. And it adapts us via the release of these factors, these rejuvenating factors that actually treat the rest of the body, even your mind. Your mind responds to exercise. Your mind is not moving by exercise. It's really these factors that are released by muscle that are carried by the bloodstream into your central nervous system. That's why your cognitive capacity increases with gravity. And that's why when you become sedentary, you start to fail cognitively. Okay, so that all requires energy. And that's what we have in common with exercise with the magnetic field, this brief treatment. Because we activate muscle energy metabolism, muscle does exactly what it would do after exercise. And it releases these factors. And it has a very, very potent metabolic effect. But as I said at the beginning, exercise is much more encompassing. Exercise is more hypertrophic. Exercise in the form of weightlifting, exercise in the form of very strenuous running, breaks you down a little bit. Again, the same thing that we interact with to improve is a force on us, is a stress on us. Because we're under gravitational force, every time I climb upstairs, I'm benefiting from it, but I'm also breaking myself down a little bit. There's wear and tear. We're soft machines. And with time, we wear down. We actually are made of proteins that have a limited lifetime. Our proteins aren't here forever. That's why when you die, you dissolve. So this is always happening. This spontaneous process of wear and tear and spontaneous entropy, which is us disintegrating, is always ongoing. It never stops. But the active part is that we regenerate. So we degenerate and regenerate in a constant rate. As we get older, our regeneration gets slower, but degeneration continues. So we start to actually fail, right? Now, when you get old and you're unable to exercise, then you actually start to undergo this degenerative cycle of basically you go into this feedback of self-degeneration. Our hope is that the magnetic response at the level of energy is maintained even though you are unable to exercise. And this way, in the elderly, in the frail, in the people that are unable to move, we can actually help support the metabolism where they would not have been able to recruit it otherwise via exercise. So in the frail and elderly, this has a very, very big implication. It turns out also that the mechanical interaction I was telling you about earlier, that force that causes us to adapt to it, what we call gravity, that's called mechanotransduction. So the cell has to feel a mechanical force, and that feeling of that mechanical force then activates the mitochondria in a sense, right? When we're interacting with gravity, a force interacts with our mitochondria. We feel a force, and that is communicated to the mitochondria, and we start to kind of respond to it. There is good evidence that suggests that mechanotransduction gets less efficient as we get older. There could be many reasons for it. It may be that the cells get stiffer, and if they get stiffer, they're less likely to respond to a mechanical force. It could be a lot of things, but it's known that the cells become less mechanically responsive as you get older. And in a sense, that may be how aging works. That may be one of the mechanisms for aging. Obviously, we all eventually die. And obviously, in a sexually reproducing organism, it's important to have death as an endpoint. If you do not, then the new gene combinations cannot be tested. We're contaminating the capacity of the population to evolve. So we have to be taken out for new gene combinations to be tested and for the species to evolve. So death is programmed into us. As just as much as recombining a sperm and an egg and their genomes to create a new organism, death is part of that big plan. It's a cycle. And it has to occur as a cycle, so it has to be birth and death. Birth makes sense. Two things come together, you grow from that. How do you actually account for death? Well, there's a lot of different ways that death is programmed into us. And one way in which death may be programmed into us is by turning down mechanosensitivity. Because again, our interacting with mechanical forces activates muscle energy metabolism, which activates the feeding response. So if we become less responsive to mechanical forces with time, if that is being dialed down, we respond less to exercise, we produce less of these factors that are released to the bloodstream, and we start to give in to spontaneous degeneration. Again, because degeneration and regeneration are always offsetting forces. They're offsetting processes. If we start to slow down regeneration, degeneration will take over and we'll eventually just succumb. So part of the death paradigm may be a dialing down of mechanical sensitivity. Okay? What if we are still able to activate that process with magnetic fields? What if, even though it's the ultimate plan to tune down mechanosensitivity, what if magnetic sensitivity still exists? That means that we can probably not get around dying, but maintain a higher quality of life until we do ultimately succumb. So in the elderly and the frail, we can help them maintain metabolism where their metabolism would normally start to fail. And we have evidence showing that is true. and our evidence base is growing, and actually it's very comforting that everything seems to be consistent in that area. But what the ultimate objective is, what the ultimate goal is to improve quality of life until the point where you do succumb, right? So right now with modern medicine, we're able to keep someone alive for longer. That's fine, and that's good, and that should be congratulated, right? We are actually keeping people alive for longer. But what if their health isn't in line with the increased longevity we're giving them? What if health span and lifespan are being disparately separated? In other words, what if health span stays until we're 70 years old? What good does it do to keep you alive till 90? If your last 20 years, you're going to be frail, unresponsive, unable to feel independent, unable to feel good about yourself, feeling like you're a burden or not even recognizing your own children. What good is those extra 20 years that we've given you, that modern medicine can actually endow upon you? What good is that? But if we're able, via technologies like this, to increase health span so that it matches our lifespan, then that'll be a total benefit on the humane level. That'll be a total benefit on the social economic level of the whole planet. That means that you are no longer a burden until you pass. Less of a burden.
Great deal you mentioned all there. I have many follow-up questions.
Very fair.
I think the first of which is, to what extent are we at the current moment able to impact the health span versus the lifespan, as well as improving the frailty of elderly using this sort of technology?
Okay, that's a very good question. I can tell you that most of the work done in the laboratory is done on model systems. And model systems give us preliminary indication that can be later translated to human studies. So there are several models for lifespan that is used in a laboratory. And they can be something as simple as a fly. They can be yeast. Yeast is a model system for lifespan. Drosophila, the fruit fly, is another one. Another one is a small roundworm called C. elegans. Okay, so they're simple systems that we understand. And if the system is simple, then anything we do with it, we understand it better, right? So in C. elegans, for example, in the worm, we know that we can extend lifespan by 17% with one exposure of the magnetic fields. We have evidence for that. But what is more important is that their health span seems to be improving as well. So it's that phase in midlife that we see that things are changing the most. And your midlife health really tells us how well you will age. People who are healthy in midlife have longer lifespans. That's why it's really important to exercise in midlife. That will set the pace for the rest of your existence. So in these model systems, we have some insights into how it works, and the effects are very promising. We look at inflammatory markers, things that are known scientifically and clinically to predict lifespan, right? We can show that we're actually making improvements there, right? For example, there's a clock that each cell has. It's something called the telomere. So every time a cell divides, it has to replicate its DNA. Because if a parent cell has, X amount of DNA, its progeny have to have X amount of DNA. And if one cell becomes two cells, that means you have to duplicate your DNA. Well, in the duplication of DNA, there's always some that is lost. And particularly, it's lost at the end of the chromosomes, which are how DNA is packaged. So that is a process that the number of times you replicate your DNA, these get smaller and smaller. And it's an internal clock. They're called the telomeres. They are the ends of chromosomes. Some data suggest that the telomeres can maintain length in individuals that undertake healthy measures. So you can actually slow down the clock in a sense. There is some indication that healthy lifestyles, exercise, can actually maintain telomere lengths. That is an indication of increased lifespan. We have some published studies showing that the enzymes responsible for increasing telomeres or responsible for maintaining telomeres at a longer length are upregulated by magnetic exposure in cell systems. These are much more difficult to do in humans and much more expensive. But now that we have all these model systems characterized and the results are starting to come out in published study, now we're doing studies in humans. And that's what's ongoing now. And we published a few studies in humans. One of them was done here at Alexandra Hospital, where we showed that indications that would normally be associated with a metabolic and physical and cognitive failing are actually improved in response to 10 minutes of exposure to our magnetic fields for once a week. So that is something that we have to keep our eyes on. It looks very promising, but it still has to be tested in all different environments, in different laboratories, in different hospitals, under different conditions. What we have is very promising, but I will never say it's a cure-all. It's not going to make you immortal. It's not going to make you something you're not. In other words, by me undergoing field treatment, I'm not going to become Usain Bolt. I am limited by my physical and my genetic, makeup. I am what I am, right? These fields will help me actually achieve a comfortable level within my limits, but it will not make me something I'm not. If you're looking to be a bodybuilder, these fields are not for you, right? Bodybuilding requires another type of muscle adaptation. It requires increasing muscle mass. Increasing muscle mass is good, but it's not the ultimate objective. Increasing muscle mass gives me strength, gives me viability, but you don't need so much. In fact, there's a lot of indications that a small, lean individual is potentially healthier, lives longer. And in fact, in the area of study of longevity, it's known that having too much tissue gain is not life-giving. It's the other way around. That's why things like caloric restriction extend lifespan. It's an adaptation to low caloric intake, makes you leaner and live longer. So these fields will not make you a bodybuilder, but they will maintain muscle mass if the muscle mass is being lost because of disuse. If you are losing muscle mass because you cannot use it, in other words, if you are unable to use your muscles and this secretion response is not able to be activated, then you lose muscle with time, because muscle even responds to its own secretions. Its own secretions maintains itself in muscle. So if you become sedentary for whatever reason, then you will start to undergo atrophy, and we've all experienced that. You put your arm in a cast, and because you can't move your arm, your muscles get smaller. That's a very natural effect. And how you would actually be able to overcome that is to actually maintain secretion. It will help maintain the muscle mass. So in states where you are actively losing muscle, we can actually slow the loss. But we will not spontaneously make you gain muscle. Also, there are two types of exercise. There are aerobic exercise, like the people who run and swim long distances, and there's resistance exercise, like people who lift weights. Those interact with your muscles in different ways. There are two classes of muscle. One of them is called oxidative muscle, and the oxidative muscle is very beneficial metabolically. Oxidative muscle is where most of your fats get burned. The other type of muscle, which is actually more the cosmetic muscle, things that give you pecs and chest and biceps, a lot of that muscle is glycolytic. It's designed for power. And it's big and it's bulky. but it exhausts very rapidly. So you can only do powerful movements for short periods, right? Oxidative muscle is different. Glycolytic muscle is powerful. Oxidative muscle is metabolic stabilizing, and it actually is fatigue resistant, all right? Those two type of muscle classes are actually sensitive to the kind of exercise you give them. One reason that we get bigger by lifting weights is that we damage the muscle. And when you damage the muscle, you make it easier to add new muscle on. For example, if I was going to renovate my bathroom, I would have to break down a few walls, and then I can make it better. And that's how muscle works. If you do a little bit of damage, you can recreate it at a higher level than what it was. But because these fields are not associated with mechanical force, there's no mechanical stress associated with these fields, then you don't actually break down muscle, so you don't have to rebuild it. But on the other hand, the secretion that we get from these muscles is actually very strong. And the reason for that is the same paradigm. If while I exercise, I damage muscle, I have to repair the muscle I've damaged during exercise. And that's always an upfront charge. That's always an overhead. I have to pay for that first. Anything that's left over, then it goes to metabolic adaptations, the secretome response, right? Now, given that these magnetic fields do not create any mechanical stress, the secretome response is very strong. So we get very strong metabolic adaptations, but we do not get very strong hypertrophic adaptations. We do not get very strong muscle growth, but its focus is on the metabolism, on the secretion of these factors. So it's a little bit different how you manage these fields. Again, they're convenient. If you cannot exercise, it's better than not exercising for sure. If you combine it with exercise, then it's actually very good. It'll synergize with the effects of exercise, of any kind of exercise. But you have to understand how to manage them. So it's not a cure-all, and we will never claim it's a cure-all, but it actually has a very strong utility. Because it activates the mitochondria of muscle very effectively, you get very strong and very robust metabolic changes. For example, in a recent publication, we showed that after 8 weeks of weekly exposure, so that's 80 minutes of total exposure. 10 minutes of exposure per 8 weeks is 80 minutes of total exposure. In a cohort of volunteers here at Alexandra Hospital, we measured their visceral fat before and after the 8 weeks of intervention. And what we found is that visceral fat went down statistically significantly after 8 weeks of total exposure in a cohort of maybe 100 people. I forget the exact numbers. It's in the publication. That's good. And you may think, okay, that's nice. But you have to put it in the context of how much intervention was given. It was 80 minutes total. That's as long as most people go to the gym at one sitting. And you would never expect a change in visceral fat after one gym session, right?
Yeah.
So we're very efficient in what we do, but we do not do everything. What we do well, but we do not do everything. Exercise is more encompassing. If you can, I would say, don't take the machine as a substitute for exercise. Take it as an adjuvant. Take it as an add-on. Take it as like if you're watching your diet when you're exercising, same thing. You do it to optimize the effect of exercise. So take it in that context. But if you cannot move, if you are frail, if you're undergoing chemotherapy and you just don't have the energy to exercise or the will, right, then this is a very good intervention for you. There's also indication that these secretions that are produced by muscle have an effect of detoxifying the body. Muscle, again, we're mostly muscle. And when you exercise, muscle is responsible for cleaning some of the system. It utilizes metabolites that would otherwise be toxic to you. And that toxicity spreads into your central nervous system. There are indications that these sorts of toxicity affect your mental well-being, are associated with depression. That's why often they recommend exercise for these cases, and they know in practice it does have positive effects sometimes. But a lot of it is that muscle, when it's activated, has a way of detoxifying the body. One way in which it does that is via a species of lipid metabolites called the ceramides. The ceramides are lipids. They're associated. They are related to fat. They're a small portion of fat. They are metabolites of fat. And there's very strong indications that increased ceramide levels are associated with diabetes. They're associated with cognitive decline. If you are sedentary, your ceramide levels go up, certain species of ceramides, right? So they seem to be associated with physiological breakdown. Whereas if you're physically active, your ceramide levels go down, right? There's some people who have actually gone on record and published it saying that ceramides are a better marker of metabolic failing than even cholesterol. And they suggested we should be looking at the ceramides instead of cholesterol to predict your health. Now, the reason I'm going into this is because we found in a cohort of healthy individuals after knee surgery that giving them 16 weeks of magnetic exposure, 1 session per week for 16 weeks, reduced the ceramide levels in the individuals that got the magnetic fields. Whereas on the other hand, the individuals that did not get the magnetic fields, their ceramide levels increased. Now, if we're able even to maintain ceramide levels low by a magnetic process, then it may translate to cognitive well-being. It may translate into other neurological disorders. There is a lot of evidence for that, right? So these are potential avenues we want to go into, but it takes time to carry out these studies. It takes time, it takes government sponsorship, it takes good partners on the ground in hospitals, community centers to do this. It's not an overnight thing, right? It takes a long time to organize these studies, but we're getting there. We have studies now going in Hong Kong. We have studies happening in the United States. We have several hospitals in Singapore that are doing studies with us. These clinical trials, these randomized controlled clinical trials are underway right now. And in a year's time, I'll be able to tell you, okay, we were right or we were wrong. But I think the way things are looking, we will be right. But again, I want to be clear for the record, exercise is better. If you need to do something for your health, exercise. And if you can't, but this is a very, very good synergistic adjuvant to exercise. And if you can't exercise, it may be your only recourse, right? And it may actually be a very good adjuvant to exercise because it's so strong in some way. There was a small study that we did with the Singapore Cycling Association, which was actually organized by QuantumTX. And they were looking at cyclists. And before the intervention, before them using our fields, there were some signs of overtraining. They were actually overdoing it. Again, remember, because exercise causes mechanical stress, and this mechanical stress comes at a cost, you have to train in a smart way so you always have a little bit left over to induce metabolic changes, right? If you overtrain, then you're actually not getting anything done. You're spending everything you've just accumulated into rebuilding, and you're not getting any metabolic changes. And you may even be at a negative deficit, right? So overtraining is that. We saw that these cyclists were giving indications of overtraining. And then we put them on field treatment for the same amount of time, and they started to improve again without a break in training. They went from an overtraining trend to actually improving again. In the sports area, I think that a big value for these fields will be in the off season, because exercise is such a mechanical stress. And because exercise is wearing you down, although it's very important, it's critically important, right? Most professional athletes, most high-level athletes have to give themselves some time off, the off season, to recuperate. And then they come back. Inevitably, when they come back, they're at a lower level than when they left off. So they have to begin again, not at zero, but a little bit, lower than they were when they took a rest. The potential is that the use of this magnetic intervention during the off season will maintain them at a higher level. So when they come back, they haven't lost that much. And it may give them a competitive advantage. But again, right, like I said at the beginning, I want to stress, it's not going to make you something you're not, right? It's not going to make every runner Usain Bolt or every, swimmer,
Michael Phelps.
Yeah, right? Those are special people. They were just given the right tools, right? The right attributes. So, but it'll make you within who you are. It'll help you achieve your optimum.
So I think a question for you is, go ahead and get some water. What are some of the research that you guys are onto? Because for me, I think it gives some insights as to what hints are you looking out for in terms of use case in the future.
Okay. So you always have to weigh the paths you take in two ways. How feasible is it to achieve and how important it is for the greater community, right? I can have very interesting work going on, but if it's not going to really affect anybody, then, I may have to reconsider it. So one area we're going into is cancer. Now, cancer, in the way that we have been speaking, remember, in the way that we activate muscle energy metabolism, that activates muscle to secrete these factors into the bloodstream, these factors are rejuvenating. Muscle goes farther than that. It actually secretes factors that are anti-cancer. And that's known. There's been studies that they take women and they exercise them. And they take the blood from women who have been exercised versus blood from women who had not been exercised, and they give that blood to breast cancer cells. The blood that had come from women who exercised slows down the breast cancer growth. That's why exercise helps your prognosis with cancer. Exercise makes you more robust, makes you more resistant, right? So it does have an anti-cancer feature, this secretome. We are showing that in the laboratory. We can show it in many different ways, but probably the easiest way to do it is in these model systems, because these model systems are simple. You can scale it up to the human level on some level, but they're still model systems, but they're very easy, which means you can control every aspect of the model system. In a human being, we have immune responses, we have diet. We cannot control an individual, a person, like we do a cell or a laboratory animal. So there's always a lot of variability in human studies. So they require much more work. But in a model system, I control everything I give to that system. I am the universe for that system. I control its temperature. I control what it eats. I control everything, so the results are often more easily interpreted. So in one model system, we take muscle cells in a plastic dish, in tissue culture. It's still muscle, and it still responds the same way. If I give it magnetic exposure, it'll secrete. And if I collect its secretion, I can then test that secretion and analyze it. It's so much simpler than a human being, right? So if I take muscle cells in a dish and I expose them for 10 minutes and I collect what they produce and I give it to cancer cells, okay, I slow down breast cancer cells. I slow down their growth. We have that data. We are now starting to characterize what it is that muscle is producing what muscle is secreting. We can do that by a lot of different experimental methodologies. And we're undertaking that. And we've actually uncovered some really interesting agents. One agent is known to be anti-aging, and it's turning out to have anti-cancer effects, which makes total sense. Because some people would go as far as saying is that cancer is an age-related disease. Right?
Yeah.
So we're actually coming up with some very, very provocative data from these model systems. We can scale it up. And say, okay, let's get away from muscle and addition. Let's do mice. So we take a group of mice, we give them magnetic exposure. We take a group of mice and we exercise them. And then we take the blood from those mice and we compare what's better. Blood that had come from exercise mice or blood that had come from animals that had been exposed by magnetic field, 10 minutes per week. Right? Usually it's 5 weeks, it can be 8 weeks. So it's 80 minutes total exposure versus 40 minutes a week of exercise, so it's 40 times 8. Right? So it's much longer. We take that blood and we didn't use it in the same way. We give it to cancer cells. And we show that blood, because the mouse is made of muscle, that blood actually has anti-cancer properties compared to mice that had received no intervention, compared to mice that just were allowed to sit in their cage and be lazy. They weren't exercised and they were not given magnetic field. So comparing these three groups of mice, the blood from these three groups of mice, we find that our magnetic fields are actually outcompeting exercise in producing anti-cancer factors. That's really provocative. Okay, so now we're at the point where we're actually looking at human trials. And we have some trials going on at NUH in Singapore, where we're looking at how is it that blood from cancer patients responds to treatment of muscle. And we're finding, well, I can't reveal too much now, but we are collecting the blood and we're doing some analysis of it. And I think it's going to come out similar. Now, the difference between a mouse and a human is that the mouse, we can put the entire mouse in the machine. Where a human, we isolate leg. So we expect a smaller response from humans, but still a similar response. So these are the things that are ongoing. So cancer is very, very, very interesting. Now, when I speak about, okay, another very important area is diabetes, metabolic dysfunction. It's engulfing the world. Metabolic dysfunction is becoming the norm rather than the exception. Most people have some kind of metabolic dysfunction by midlife. I think at least a few years ago, they were saying that we are the first generation that will probably live less than the previous generation. So as a population, we are actually starting to break down. And a lot of it is metabolic dysfunction. A lot of it is an inflammatory state coming from the diet, coming from a lot of things. Lack of activity, diet, many things. Right? Now, in this muscle secretion axis that we're focusing on, right? You can get muscle secretion by exercise. You get muscle secretion by these magnetic fields, right? Muscle secretes things, and the recipient tissue is very important, right? One of the strongest recipients of muscle secretions is fat. Okay, so we have a lot of fat. Generally, we have more fat than we need, right? So fat is a recipient of the muscle secretome. Now, it's interesting that when fat is activated by the muscle secretome, it then becomes a secretor itself. And it secretes things back that actually reinforce this positive communication. It's called muscle-fat crosstalk. Now, you may see in the literature as muscle-adipose crosstalk, right? But muscle-fat crosstalk. So there is a cross-communication between muscle and fat that occurs via their respective secretomes. And they can be reinforcing in the positive way or in the negative way. when fat is not being stimulated by muscle, its secretions are inflammatory. And its secretions are a large part of why we get diabetes and inflammatory disorders. So the secretion from fat in a sedentary individual is toxic for the individual. The secretion from fat from sedentary individuals actually was noted as one of the indications how well you're going to do against COVID. Right? They would say, no, people with these inflammatory states are much more susceptible to more advanced and aggressive COVID. So the fact that these individuals had an inflammatory fat secretions, they were more sensitive to infection and COVID. So it affects us in every way. But if you start muscle secreting, affecting adipose, that crosstalk then becomes strengthening. So the crosstalk can be in a negative way or in a positive way. And it's positive when it's kicked off by exercise and now maybe by these magnetic fields. So again, this inflammatory status that is most prominent in individuals that are sedentary because adipose is releasing, a milieu, a mixture of factors that are basically inflammatory, it'll even affect the nervous system at a very, very fundamental level. It's all about that small organelle that I referred to at the beginning called the mitochondria. The mitochondria are responsible for producing energy. Right? In this universe, we cannot create energy nor matter. They have to be exchanged. We can consider ourselves a closed system. Nothing gets spontaneously generated. They're exchanging. Right? So if we want to change in any way, if we want to adapt, if we want to become stronger, if we want to heal, it all requires energy. Nothing comes for free. And because energy is actually produced by the mitochondria are what's really responsible for us adapting. And the reason we chose muscle is because muscle is a huge source of mitochondria. So we learned how to activate mitochondria with these magnetic fields. And we target muscle because it's a very rich source of mitochondria. And we target muscle because of its general effect, its life-giving effects over the entire organism. And that's actually an incredible gift that it worked out that way. That means by activating this response in muscle, we have access to metabolic disorders, mental decline, cancer, a host of other ailments that can all be linked back to the muscle secretome. And it's just going to be a process of taking time and understanding how and when to apply in the best way. But if we continue the way we're going, it's going to be very promising. I think ultimately, I honestly feel that ultimately this technology will become a lifestyle intervention. And I hope that we can do a convincing enough job that governments start thinking, maybe this is something we should actually have part of a curriculum. We should have it, in elder care homes. We should have it, in many different scenarios, that just like your lifestyle. Just like now we get vitamins, right? Things that we make them part of our daily routine. This, hopefully one day, if we do everything right and everything goes as it looks to be going, it will be part of a larger scheme of body maintenance, right? So that's where we may go, and only time will tell if it's achievable, right? And I think all we have to do is play it smart. We have to actually base ourselves on science. We have to actually base ourselves on science and on hard facts. And we have to let everyone know what our strengths are and what our limitations are. right? So that's something that's actually very important, because we don't want people going out there taking this technology and doing things that are counterproductive, right? So we have to manage how this goes out. And then I think when everything gets said and done, it'll turn out we have a clear picture where its utility lies and where it's not. Like I told you, it's not going to be a muscle building device. So if you want to actually build muscle, it's not for you, but it'll help you during exercise to get the most of it. But on its own, it's not going to make you bulky, right? And in fact, every indication is that a leaner person is better than a bulky person.
Thanks so much for sharing about your work. Before we round off, just one last question. Is there anything that you want to add that I might not have asked?
Yes. And this is actually a very, very subtle point, but it's actually a very important point. The mitochondria is important for creating energy. But the mitochondria also produce reactive oxygen species. They are a byproduct of using oxygen for the production of energy. In other words, what I want to say is that if I take a bite of apple, what I'm really looking for in that apple via my hunger and my need is hydrocarbons, a carbon and a hydrogen linked by an atomic bond. What I really want is those electrons, because that's how I make energy, is via these electrons. So what happens is that I take an apple, I bite it, I actually break it down in my digestive system to simple sugars, and simple sugars are hydrocarbons, as glucose is. And then these hydrocarbons are actually processed in the cell to capture these electrons to make energy in the mitochondria. Okay. But electrons by themselves, not good. They have to come with a proton, another hydrogen, to kind of stabilize them. But you can't just collect electrons. That's not good. So what we do is we inhale oxygen. And oxygen is an electron acceptor. So oxygen captures the electron and captures the hydrogen and makes water. And the carbon backbone also also joins with oxygen, and we exhale carbon dioxide. So we inhale oxygen to capture electrons, and we generate water, and we exhale carbon dioxide. That's how the cycle is. So we take hydrocarbons, we ingest them, and they ultimately turn into water and carbon dioxide, and the electrons that are processed during that chain of events creates energy, and that's what keeps us alive. The reason I went through all this is that sometimes that capturing of electrons by oxygen is not very efficient. And sometimes oxygen does not do a good job. And when it doesn't do a good job, it creates a free radical. It creates something that is commonly known as reactive oxygen species. And these reactive oxygen species are a form of cellular stress. The subtle part comes is that when the mitochondria are milling electrons to form energy, they produce reactive oxygen species. But that reactive oxygen species is a signal that tells the mitochondria how to adapt. Exercise is the same thing. I stress myself exercising, I adapt to it. The mitochondria do the same thing. They stress themselves in producing energy, and they produce something that they adapt to. So really, our improvement in muscle is a mirror of the improvement of the mitochondria. It's a microcosm. So our gains in muscle, in energy, is really a mitochondrial response. That is very important because mitochondrial health directly correlates with human health. And because muscle is such a huge reservoir of mitochondria, muscle health then relates to human health. So our magnetic fields, because they activate mitochondrial energy metabolism, if you do it right, they create reactive oxygen species that are low enough to allow the adaptation of the mitochondria. But if you do it too much, they may not be able to adapt to the reactive oxygen species, but become vulnerable to them. So our magnetic fields are very low energy, and they're designed only to initiate that adaptation response. That production of reactive oxygen species, which then is adaptive to the mitochondria. And if we adapt the mitochondria, that means the muscle adapts. And if the muscle adapts, that means the body adapts. So we are relying on this process of adaptation of the mitochondria using low levels of stress. But if a tissue is already stressed metabolically, then maybe you don't want to expose it to the fields directly because it's already undergoing enough stress on its own. So there has to be some smart thinking about what tissues to use and what tissues not to use. For example, if I had a major rip in a muscle, I probably don't want to expose that major rip because probably that tissue is dealing with enough at the moment. But because it's a feeding response, I can always go to the healthy leg. I can expose the uninjured leg. And that uninjured leg will still respond positively, release these factors. These factors get released into the bloodstream, and they will feed the injured leg. So that is a change in clinical philosophy. Generally in the hospital, you go for the site of injury. But in this case, it's probably better to actually expose a healthy tissue, a healthy muscle, for its feeding response, and that way you actually get a positive effect in the injured tissue because the bloodstream, which receives these factors, travels throughout the body. So it's going to be something we have to get people used to. You know, it's probably better to treat a healthy muscle to have it feed an injured site. I'm not saying by exposing the injured site you're going to cause damage, but it may not help it regenerate as fast. It's probably better to go for a healthy limb. So these are things we have to actually let everyone know and how to use it appropriately, right? We found in clinical trials that if we go for an injured leg, expose the injured leg, the body still benefits, right? But it may have been a greater benefit by going to a healthy limb, okay? So these are subtle things.
Cool. I will be really interested to do a follow-up maybe a year later or another year after that to find out about all the results of the trials and the research that you guys are doing. But with this, we would like to end today's episode. If you like what we have spoken about, if you are interested, feel free to check out the equipment here at General Hospital. Feel free to talk to the guys at QuantumTX or put your comments in the comment section below. Till next time, take care.